They say there is only war in the darkness of the far future, and they are right. But what they don't tell you is that war has rules, and some of those rules are written in the hearts of warriors rather than the pages of tactical manuals. My name was Brother Captain Aurelius Thane of the Ultramarines' 5th Company, and I learned that mercy is not weakness. It is a burden so terrible that it can destroy everything you thought you knew about honor, duty, and the Emperor's will. For 217 years, I served the Imperium with unwavering devotion. My bolter had spoken death to 10,000 enemies across 100 worlds. My power sword had carved through the ranks of heretics, xenos, and traitors with the precision that only comes from absolute certainty in the righteousness of one's core. I was everything a space marine should be: fearless, brutal, efficient, and utterly without compassion for the enemies of mankind. But compassion, I would learn, is not something you can simply switch off when it becomes inconvenient. It lives in the depths of your consciousness like a cancer, growing stronger with each act of violence until it threatens to consume everything you believe about yourself and your purpose. The change began on Mordak's 7th, a hive world that had fallen to a genestealer cult uprising. The infestation had spread through the population centers like a plague, turning loyal Imperial citizens into willing servants of the Tyrannid menace. Our mission was straightforward: eliminate all infected personnel and cleanse the planet for eventual recolonization. It should have been routine. The Codex Astartes provided clear protocols for dealing with genestealer cult contamination. No prisoners, no negotiations, no mercy for those who had betrayed their own species through willing submission to xenos influence. Swift, clean extermination, followed by thorough sterilization of all potentially infected areas. But war is never as clean as the tactical manuals suggest, and the line between enemy and victim is not always as clear as doctrine would have us believe. I first encountered the moral complexity of our mission during the assault on Hive Tertius, where my strike force had been tasked with clearing the residential sectors. These had once been home to millions of ordinary Imperial citizens, workers, clerks, merchants, and their families, who had committed no crime beyond existing in the wrong place when the genestealer infection took hold. As we moved through the hab blocks, our Auspex readings detected massive concentrations of infected personnel. But when we breached the first residential complex, what we found challenged every assumption I had made about the nature of our enemy. The infected humans were not the slavering monsters described in our briefing materials. They were families, huddled together in makeshift shelters, their faces showing fear rather than alien malevolence. Children clung to parents who bore the subtle physical markers of genestealer contamination: slightly elongated limbs, patches of chitinous skin, eyes that reflected light with an unnatural sheen. But these were still recognizably human beings, still capable of terror and love and hope, despite the alien influence that had changed their biology. They begged for mercy in High Gothic, pleading for their children's lives with words that cut through my transhuman conditioning like monomolecular blades. "Please," whispered a woman whose left arm had been replaced by a chitinous appendage that ended in razor-sharp claws. "My daughter is only 7 years old. She doesn't understand what's happening to her. Can't you help us?" The girl she referred to showed advanced signs of infection. Her scalp bore bony ridges that would eventually develop into the characteristic head crest of a pure strain genestealer, and her fingers had begun to elongate into claws. But she was still a child, still innocent despite the contamination that coursed through her veins. According to the Codex Astartes, both mother and daughter were enemies of humanity to be eliminated without hesitation. Their infection made them irredeemable, weapons of an alien intelligence that sought to consume all human life. The tactical doctrine was clear: show no mercy to those who had been compromised by xenos influence, regardless of how they had come to be infected. But as I looked into the child's eyes, still human despite the alien modifications beginning to manifest in her physiology, I found myself hesitating. She was afraid, confused, reaching out for comfort from a mother who could no longer provide the protection she desperately needed. "Brother Captain," voxed Sergeant Cassius, my second in command, "awaiting orders to engage." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 5 battle brothers stood ready to unleash the Emperor's wrath upon these infected civilians, their bolters loaded with mass-reactive rounds that would reduce human bodies to component atoms. It would be quick, efficient, and absolutely in accordance with established doctrine. But I could not give the order. "Stand down," I commanded, my voice carrying across the tactical channel. "These civilians are not combatants." We withdraw and establish a containment perimeter. The silence that followed was deafening. Through my helmet's display, I could see the confusion in my battle brothers' biometric readings. What I had just ordered violated every principle of xenos contamination protocols, contradicted centuries of tactical doctrine, and potentially compromised our mission objectives. "Sir," Cassius transmitted on a private channel, "the contamination protocols are explicit. These individuals cannot be allowed to survive." "I am aware of the protocols, Sergeant," I replied. "But I am also aware that our duty is to protect the innocent, not simply to follow orders without thought or consideration." That was my first mistake, believing that mercy and duty could coexist within the framework of Imperial doctrine. I thought I could find a middle path that would satisfy both my conscience and my obligations as a space marine. But mercy, once awakened, does not accept compromise or half measures. We established a quarantine zone around the infected population centers, posting guard rotations to prevent any contaminated individuals from escaping, while I requested guidance from Chapter Command. My report was carefully worded, emphasizing the non-combatant status of the infected civilians and the possibility of finding alternative solutions to wholesale extermination. The response came within hours, delivered by Captain Sicarius himself via encrypted Vox transmission. "Brother Captain Thane, you will implement full sterilization protocols immediately. No exceptions, no delays, no further consultation required." This is a direct order from Chapter Master Kalga. The order was unambiguous, backed by the highest authority within our chapter. Refusal would constitute insubordination of the gravest kind, potentially resulting in my removal from command and formal censure. But compliance would mean the deliberate execution of thousands of civilians whose only crime was infection by an alien parasite. I found myself faced with a choice that the Codex Astartes had never prepared me for. Obey orders that violated my understanding of honor, or follow my conscience into what might be construed as heresy. The decision I made in that moment would haunt me for the remainder of my service to the Emperor. "Negative, Chapter Command," I transmitted. "I require additional time to evaluate alternative containment strategies. The situation is more complex than initial reports indicated." It was not an outright refusal, but it was tantamount to insubordination. I was buying time for the infected civilians, hoping to find some solution that would satisfy both Imperial doctrine and my increasingly troubled conscience. Over the following days, as my company maintained the quarantine perimeter, I found myself returning repeatedly to the civilian sectors. Ostensibly, these visits were for tactical assessment and intelligence gathering. In reality, I was trying to understand how ordinary human beings had become willing collaborators with an alien intelligence. What I discovered challenged every assumption I had been taught about the nature of Genestealer cult infiltration. The infection had not been forced upon these people through violence or coercion. It had spread through families, passed from parents to children as an expression of love rather than contamination. The infected individuals genuinely believed that their transformation represented evolution rather than corruption, seeing their alien characteristics as improvements rather than deformities. Most disturbing of all, they retained their essential humanity despite the physical changes. They cared for their children, mourned their dead, and hoped for better futures with the same emotional depth that characterized any human community. The alien influence had changed their biology and their loyalties, but it had not destroyed their capacity for love, fear, joy, and sorrow. I spoke with dozens of infected civilians during these visits, learning their stories and trying to understand the process by which loyal Imperial citizens had become willing servants of the tyrannid menace. Each conversation deepened my conviction that these people were victims rather than willing traitors, casualties of a conflict they had never chosen to join. There was Marcus Kellion, a factory supervisor who had been infected while trying to rescue his daughter from a genestealer attack. The alien organism had saved his life, healing injuries that would have been fatal, but the price had been his humanity. He spoke of his transformation with a mixture of gratitude and regret, acknowledging that he could no longer claim loyalty to the Imperium while simultaneously mourning the loss of his original identity. There was Sister Miriam, a former member of the local ecclesiarchy who had willingly accepted infection after witnessing what she described as the true face of the divine. Her faith remained strong, but it had been redirected toward the alien intelligence that promised unity and transcendence rather than the distant emperor who demanded only sacrifice and obedience. Most heartbreaking was young Elena Voss, the 7-year-old girl whose mother had pleaded for mercy during our initial encounter. The child's infection was progressing rapidly, her human features gradually giving way to alien characteristics, but her personality remained unchanged. She played with toys, laughed at simple jokes, and asked innocent questions about the big metal men who watched over her community. Each of these encounters reinforced my growing belief that Imperial doctrine was inadequate for dealing with the moral complexities of genestealer cult contamination. These people were not monsters to be destroyed without thought, but human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. But my compassion for the infected civilians was beginning to affect the morale and discipline of my own company. Battle brothers who had served with me for decades began questioning my orders, their loyalty strained by commands that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about duty and honor. "Brother Captain," Sergeant Cassius approached me during one of my visits to the civilian sectors. "The men are beginning to talk. They don't understand why we're protecting xenos sympathizers instead of carrying out our orders." I looked at him through my helmet's optical display, seeing the concern in his biometric readings. Cassius was a good Marine, a loyal servant of the Emperor who had never questioned an order in 30 years of service. But now I was asking him to participate in what appeared to be dereliction of duty, and the strain was showing. "These are not xenos sympathizers, Sergeant," I replied. "They are Imperial citizens who have been victimized by alien contamination. Our duty is to protect the innocent, not to massacre civilians because their suffering inconveniences our tactical doctrine." "But the contamination makes them enemies of humanity," Cassius argued. "The Codex is clear about this. We cannot allow sentiment to override our strategic obligations." His words were technically correct, supported by centuries of tactical doctrine and countless precedents. But they failed to account for the human cost of implementing such policies, the moral injury inflicted upon warriors forced to destroy those they had sworn to protect. "The Codex provides guidance, not absolute law," I said. "We are thinking warriors, not mindless automata. We have the responsibility to evaluate each situation according to its unique circumstances." But even as I spoke, I could feel the foundation of my authority eroding. Command structure in the Adeptus Astartes depends upon absolute trust between officers and their subordinates. When that trust is compromised by conflicting interpretations of duty, the entire system begins to break down. The crisis came to a head when Chapter Master Calgar himself arrived on Mordax 7, accompanied by a full company of Ultramarines and a delegation from the Inquisition. Their presence made it clear that my unauthorized delay in implementing sterilization protocols had attracted attention from the highest levels of Imperial authority. The confrontation took place in the command center of our temporary base, with the infected civilian sectors visible through reinforced windows that offered a clear view of the homes and shelters I had spent weeks protecting. "Brother Captain Thane," Calgar's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, Explain your failure to implement direct orders regarding the elimination of xenos-contaminated personnel. I stood at attention, knowing that my next words would determine not only my own fate, but potentially the lives of thousands of infected civilians. The chapter master's reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his adherence to Imperial doctrine. He would not be swayed by appeals to mercy or compassion. "My lord," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I have determined that the contaminated civilians pose minimal immediate threat and may provide valuable intelligence regarding Genestealer cult infiltration methods. I believe that additional study was warranted before implementing irreversible sterilization measures." It was a carefully constructed justification that emphasized tactical considerations over emotional concerns. But Calga's expression made it clear that he was not deceived by my attempts to frame mercy as strategic thinking. "Brother Captain, are you suggesting that the Codex Astartes is deficient in its treatment of xenos contamination protocols?" The question was a trap, designed to force me into either explicit criticism of sacred doctrine or admission that my actions had been motivated by sentiment rather than tactical considerations. Either answer would provide grounds for my removal from command. "No, my lord," I replied. "I am suggesting that the Codex provides principles that must be applied with wisdom and judgment to specific circumstances. The contaminated civilians are not combatants, and their elimination serves no tactical purpose beyond compliance with doctrine." "Compliance with doctrine is not a tactical consideration, brother Captain. It is the foundation upon which the Imperium has survived for 10,000 years. When individual judgment supersedes established protocol, the entire structure of Imperial authority is threatened." His words carried the finality of a death sentence. By appealing to individual judgment over doctrinal compliance, I had revealed the heretical nature of my thinking. No matter how pure my motives, I had placed personal conscience above Imperial law. "Furthermore," Calga continued, "Inquisitor Vex has informed me that your unauthorized contact with contaminated personnel has potentially exposed you to memetic contamination. You will submit to immediate purification protocols and removal from active duty pending investigation." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Memetic contamination, the possibility that exposure to alien influences had compromised my loyalty and judgment, was one of the most serious charges that could be leveled against an Imperial officer. It suggested that my mercy toward the infected civilians was not the result of moral conviction, but alien manipulation. But as I considered the possibility, I realized it didn't matter. Whether my compassion was genuine human emotion or the result of subtle xenos influence, it had led me to the same conclusion, that the wholesale slaughter of infected civilians was wrong, regardless of what Imperial doctrine demanded. "I will submit to any investigation you deem necessary, my lord," I said, "but I request that the civilian population be spared until such investigation is complete." Calga's expression showed a mixture of disappointment and something that might have been pity. "Brother Captain, your request demonstrates exactly why individual judgment cannot be allowed to override established doctrine. You have allowed sentiment to compromise your effectiveness as a space marine. With respect, my lord, I have allowed conscience to inform my understanding of duty. There is a difference between effectiveness and righteousness." The words were barely out of my mouth before I realized their implication. By distinguishing between effectiveness and righteousness, I was suggesting that Imperial doctrine might be effective but not righteous, a distinction that bordered on heretical thinking. The trial that followed was a formality, its outcome predetermined by my own statements and actions. I was found guilty of insubordination, dereliction of duty, and potential memetic contamination. My rank was stripped, my command transferred, and my service record amended to reflect my failure to uphold the standards expected of an ultramarine officer. But the most devastating consequence was not my personal disgrace. It was watching from detention as the sterilization protocols were finally implemented. The execution of the infected civilians was carried out with the cold efficiency that characterizes all Astartes operations. Entire residential blocks were cleared in a matter of hours, their inhabitants eliminated by warriors who felt nothing as they pulled their triggers. No mercy was shown to the children, the elderly, or the terrified families who had trusted me to protect them. I watched through security monitors as young Elena Voss was cut down by bolter fire, her 7-year-old body torn apart by mass-reactive rounds designed to kill creatures far larger and more dangerous than infected children. Her mother died trying to shield her, maternal love proving inadequate against the demands of Imperial doctrine. Marcus Kellion, the factory supervisor who had spoken of his transformation with such eloquent regret, was incinerated by a heavy flamer team. His last words, picked up by audio sensors, were a prayer to the Emperor for forgiveness, not for his infection, but for failing to find a way to remain human despite the alien influence that had saved his life. Sister Miriam, the former ecclesiarchy member whose faith had been redirected but never diminished, faced her death with the same courage she had once shown in service to the Imperial creed. She died praying, though whether to the Emperor or the alien intelligence that had promised her transcendence, I will never know. Thousands of others followed, each death a small tragedy that accumulated into a holocaust of suffering inflicted in the name of tactical necessity. Every life extinguished was a reminder of my failure to find an alternative solution, my inability to reconcile mercy with duty in a universe that demanded absolute compliance with doctrinal purity. The purification protocols applied to my own mind were almost as devastating as watching the civilian massacre. Tech Marines and librarians worked for days to identify and eliminate any trace of alien influence in my thoughts and memories, using techniques that stripped away not only potential contamination, but much of what had made me an individual rather than simply another space marine. When the process was complete, I retained my memories, but not the emotional context that had given them meaning. I could recall my conversations with the infected civilians, but I could no longer access the compassion that had motivated my protection of them. The capacity for mercy that had defined my actions on Mordak's 7th was gone, burned away by psychers who saw it as a weakness to be eliminated rather than a virtue to be preserved. I was assigned to a penitent crusade, a mission designed to restore my honor through service in the most dangerous war zones the Imperium had to offer. For 50 years, I fought alongside other disgraced Marines, proving my loyalty through acts of suicidal bravery and unquestioning obedience to orders. The irony was not lost on me. In seeking to restore my honor through absolute compliance with doctrine, I became exactly the kind of unthinking killer that my former self would have despised. I killed without hesitation, showed no mercy to any enemy, and never again questioned orders regardless of their moral implications. But the restoration of my tactical effectiveness came at the cost of everything that had made mercy seem important in the first place. I could no longer understand why I had once cared about the fate of infected civilians, or felt compelled to protect those who could not protect themselves. The emotional capacity that had made such concerns meaningful had been surgically removed from my consciousness. During the crusade, I encountered similar situations dozens of times. Civilians caught in war zones, non-combatants threatened by military operations, innocents whose lives hung in the balance of tactical decisions. In each case, I followed doctrine without deviation, implementing whatever measures were deemed necessary for mission success, regardless of collateral damage. On Talon Quintus, I ordered the bombardment of a refugee camp that might have harbored enemy infiltrators. On Cadia Secundus, I authorized the use of chemical weapons against a population center where civilians and combatants could not be reliably distinguished. On Vrax Prime, I supervised the execution of surrendering enemy soldiers who had attempted to negotiate terms for the protection of their families. Each action was tactically sound, doctrinally correct, and absolutely necessary for the successful completion of our assigned missions. But they were also the kind of decisions that my pre-purification self would have struggled to make. Choices that required the elimination of mercy as a factor in military planning. I became an exemplar of space marine efficiency, a warrior who could implement any order without hesitation or moral consideration. My superiors praised my restoration to proper function, noting that the purification process had successfully eliminated the weakness that had compromised my effectiveness on Mordax 7. But late at night, during the brief rest periods between campaigns, I found myself staring at the ceiling of whatever barracks or transport vessel housed me, trying to remember what it had felt like to care about the fate of strangers. The memories were there. I could recall every detail of my interactions with the infected civilians, but the emotional weight that had made those interactions significant was gone. It was like trying to remember the taste of food you had eaten years ago, or the sound of music you had heard in childhood. You might retain the factual details, but the sensory experience that had made those details meaningful was irretrievably lost. The turning point came during the siege of Meridian Hive, where our forces had been tasked with retaking an industrial complex from Orc invaders. The operation was proceeding according to plan when we discovered that the Orcs had taken human hostages, workers who had been trapped in the facility when the Greenskins overran its defenses. Standard doctrine called for the elimination of all personnel within the complex, hostages included. The risk of rescue operations was deemed unacceptable, and the strategic value of the industrial facility outweighed concerns about collateral casualties among the civilian population. As I prepared to order the bombardment that would destroy the complex along with everyone inside it, I caught sight of a child's face through the scope of my bolter. A young girl, perhaps 6 years old, being held by an Orc boy who seemed to view her as an amusing trophy rather than a serious threat. For a moment, just a moment, I hesitated. Something in the child's expression, the terror in her eyes, the way she clutched a torn stuffed animal despite her desperate circumstances, triggered a memory of Elena Voss. The infected girl whose death I had witnessed through security monitors, whose mother had begged for mercy that I had been unable to provide. The similarity was purely superficial. This child showed no signs of alien contamination, was threatened by Orcs rather than Genis stealers, existed in completely different tactical circumstances. But something about her vulnerability, her absolute dependence on adults who had failed to protect her, reminded me of what I had lost when the purification protocols eliminated my capacity for mercy. I found myself lowering my weapon, my finger hesitating on the trigger that would have initiated the bombardment sequence. For the first time in decades, I questioned whether tactical doctrine was sufficient guidance for moral decision-making. "Brother Captain," Sergeant Marcus voxed, using the rank I had regained through successful completion of the Penitent Crusade. "Awaiting bombardment authorization." The words were familiar, echoing Sergeant Cassius's request for orders during that first encounter with infected civilians on Mordax 7. But this time, the stakes were different. Showing mercy to this child would not violate contamination protocols or risk spreading alien influence. It would simply mean prioritizing human life over tactical efficiency. "Negative," I replied. "We assault the complex directly. Hostage rescue is a secondary objective, but it is an objective. The assault was costly, resulting in casualties that could have been avoided through bombardment. 3 of my battle brothers died clearing the Orc positions, and several more were wounded by enemy fire that had been neutralized through orbital strike. But we saved the hostages, including the girl whose face had triggered my moment of moral awakening. As I carried her to safety, her small hand gripping my armored gauntlet with desperate trust, I realized that mercy was not a weakness to be purged from my consciousness. It was the quality that distinguished protectors from mere killers, that gave meaning to concepts like honor and duty beyond simple obedience to authority. The purification protocols had not eliminated my capacity for mercy. They had simply buried it beneath layers of conditioning and indoctrination. But like a deeply rooted plant that survives winter by going dormant, that capacity had endured, waiting for the right circumstances to manifest itself again. That realization marked the beginning of my true restoration, not to the unthinking efficiency that my superiors valued, but to the complex moral awareness that had made me question orders on Mordax 7. I began to understand that the choice between mercy and duty was a false dichotomy, that true honor lay in finding ways to serve both principles rather than sacrificing one for the other. But the Imperium does not reward such complexity of thought, and my renewed capacity for moral consideration soon brought me into conflict with the same doctrinal limitations that had destroyed my first command. The crisis came during the pacification of the Aurelian sector, where my company had been assigned to suppress a rebellion on the hive world of Ostus Prime. The insurgents were not alien cultists or chaos traitors, but ordinary citizens who had been driven to revolt by the brutal policies of their planetary government. The rebellion had been triggered by increased tithe demands that left the population on the edge of starvation, enforced by arbitrators who showed no mercy to those unable to meet their obligations. Entire families had been enslaved for debt, their children sold to off-world labor contracts to satisfy accounts that could never realistically be repaid. When peaceful protests were met with mass executions, the population had risen in desperate rebellion. They possessed no military training, no sophisticated weapons, no strategic objectives beyond the basic desire to survive the policies that were slowly murdering them through bureaucratic neglect. Our orders were to restore Imperial authority through whatever means necessary, with explicit instructions to make examples of the ringleaders that would discourage future resistance. The sector government wanted a demonstration of Imperial power that would crush not only the current rebellion, but the spirit that had made it possible. As we prepared for the assault on the main population centers, I found myself studying intelligence reports that painted a picture of desperation rather than sedition. These were not hardened revolutionaries or ideological extremists, but ordinary people driven to violence by circumstances that left them no other choice. The tactical solution was straightforward: massive application of force, followed by public executions of anyone identified as a leader or organizer. But the moral implications were more complex, requiring consideration of whether Imperial authority was worth preserving when it was being used to implement policies that amounted to slow genocide. I made the decision to attempt negotiation before resorting to violence, hoping to find a solution that would satisfy both Imperial requirements and basic human decency. It was a calculated risk that I justified through appeals to tactical efficiency. Negotiated surrender would reduce casualties among my own forces while potentially gathering intelligence about the rebellion's organization and support networks. The rebel representatives who agreed to meet with me were exactly what I had expected: frightened civilians who had been thrust into leadership roles by circumstances beyond their control. They had no grand political agenda, no desire to overthrow Imperial rule, no connection to any external enemies of the Imperium. They simply wanted their families to have enough food to survive the winter, wanted their children to avoid being sold into slavery, wanted some acknowledgement that they possessed basic rights as human beings rather than existing solely as resources to be exploited by their betters. "We don't want to fight you," their spokesman, a former factory supervisor named Yorick Vane, told me during our first meeting. "We know we can't win against Space Marines, but we can't just surrender and watch our children starve while the nobility builds new palaces with our tithe money." His words carried the simple dignity of someone who had been pushed beyond endurance but retained enough humanity to prefer death to submission. These people were willing to die not for ideology or personal ambition, but for the basic principle that human life should have some value beyond its economic productivity. I found myself moved by their desperation, recognizing in their situation the same moral complexity that had characterized the infected civilians on Mordax 7th. These rebels were not enemies of humanity, but victims of systems that valued compliance over compassion, efficiency over human dignity. But the sector government rejected any negotiated settlement that did not include mass executions and collective punishment for the rebellious population. Governor Thaddeus Vane, a man whose vast wealth had been built upon exactly the kind of exploitation that had triggered the rebellion, demanded that we make examples that would discourage future resistance. "These people must learn that defying Imperial authority has consequences," he explained during our strategy meeting. "Show them mercy now, and every world in the sector will think they can negotiate their way out of their tithe obligations." His logic was sound from a certain perspective. Imperial authority depended upon the perception that resistance was both futile and catastrophically costly. Allowing rebels to achieve anything through violence would encourage others to attempt similar actions, potentially destabilizing the entire sector. But the cost of maintaining that authority through terror was the reduction of Imperial citizens to the status of livestock, valued only for their capacity to produce resources for their betters. It was a system that contradicted everything I had been taught about the Emperor's love for humanity and our duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. I found myself faced with the same impossible choice that had destroyed my first command: follow orders that violated my understanding of honor, or act according to conscience and face the consequences of insubordination. This time, I chose a middle path that I hoped would satisfy both my moral obligations and my duty to Imperial authority. Instead of implementing the mass executions that Governor Vane demanded, I negotiated a settlement that addressed the rebels' grievances while maintaining Imperial control over the planet. The tithe demands were reduced to sustainable levels, the debt slavery system was abolished, and the most corrupt local officials were removed from power. In exchange, the rebels agreed to disperse peacefully and accept punishment for their ringleaders that stopped short of execution. It was a compromise that preserved lives while maintaining the appearance of Imperial authority, though it fell short of the terroristic display that Governor Vane had requested. The sector government accepted the settlement with obvious reluctance, recognizing that it achieved their strategic objectives while denying them the psychological satisfaction of total victory. But my superiors within the Adeptus Astartes were less forgiving of my unauthorized modifications to their orders. "Brother, Captain Thane." Chapter Master Calgar's voice carried familiar disapproval as he delivered my second formal reprimand in a century of service. "You have again demonstrated a troubling tendency to substitute personal judgment for established doctrine." "My lord," I replied, "I achieved all stated mission objectives while minimizing casualties among both Imperial forces and civilian populations. The rebellion has been suppressed, Imperial authority maintained, and the sector secured against future unrest. But you did so through methods that contradict established protocols for dealing with seditious populations. Your negotiated settlement sets a precedent that will encourage other rebels to believe they can achieve their goals through violence if they simply hold out long enough for a reasonable Imperial response." His criticism was valid from a strategic perspective. By showing mercy to the rebels on Ostus Prime, I had indeed created a precedent that might encourage similar uprisings elsewhere. The Imperium's stability depended upon absolute deterrence, the certainty that rebellion would result in consequences so severe that no rational person would attempt it. But I had also demonstrated that Imperial authority could be maintained through justice rather than terror, that citizens who felt they were being treated fairly were more likely to remain loyal than those who lived in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. "My lord," I said, "I believe that mercy and justice serve Imperial interests more effectively than terror and oppression. Citizens who trust their government are more reliable than those who obey only from fear. Brother Captain, your beliefs are irrelevant to your duty as a Space Marine. We do not implement policy. We enforce the policies implemented by our superiors. When individual officers begin substituting their own judgment for established authority, the entire command structure becomes compromised." It was the same argument he had used to justify my first punishment, the same logic that reduced Space Marines to unthinking weapons rather than thinking warriors. But I was no longer the same officer who had been broken by purification protocols and reconstructed according to doctrinal specifications. "With respect, my lord, thinking warriors must be capable of adapting doctrine to circumstances. The Codex Astartes provides principles, not absolute laws. When those principles conflict with honor and justice, we have a responsibility to choose the path that best serves humanity rather than simply the path that satisfies bureaucratic requirements. The words were barely out of my mouth before I realized I had repeated the same heretical reasoning that had led to my first downfall. By placing honor and justice above doctrinal compliance, I was again asserting the primacy of individual conscience over institutional authority. But this time, I was prepared for the consequences. The second trial was more thorough than the first, involving not only ultramarine leadership but representatives from the Adeptus Ministorum and the Inquisition. The charges included repeated insubordination, advocacy of heretical principles, and potential corruption by exposure to seditious ideologies. The evidence against me was overwhelming. My own statements provided clear proof that I valued personal judgment over established doctrine, preferred negotiation to decisive action, and believed that mercy was compatible with effective military leadership. By any objective standard, I had repeatedly failed to meet the requirements of my position. But I was no longer interested in defending myself according to those standards. I am guilty of showing mercy to those who deserved it, I told the tribunal. I am guilty of seeking justice rather than simply implementing orders. I am guilty of believing that our duty as Space Marines extends beyond mere obedience to authority. And I am guilty of remembering that we serve the Emperor not because he demands submission, but because he embodies the highest ideals of human civilization. When those ideals conflict with Imperial policy, I choose the ideals. It was a statement of philosophical rebellion that left no room for compromise or mitigation. I had explicitly rejected the authority of Imperial institutions in favor of abstract principles that I claimed transcended earthly power structures. The sentence was inevitable. Degradation to the rank of battle brother. Assignment to a death company equivalent where my skills could be utilized while my dangerous ideas were contained, and eventual deployment to conflicts where survival was unlikely. But the sentence came with an unexpected addendum. Brother Aurelius, Chapter Master Calgar addressed me using my first name rather than rank for the first time in our acquaintance. Your courage and tactical skills are beyond question. Your compassion for those under your protection is admirable, even when it leads you into conflict with necessary doctrine. But the Imperium cannot function if every officer substitutes personal judgment for established authority. The mercy you value so highly would become meaningless if it led to the collapse of the civilization you seek to protect. His words carried a weight of sadness that I had not expected from someone so thoroughly committed to Imperial doctrine. For a moment, I saw not the implacable enforcer of orthodoxy, but a man who understood the moral cost of the policies he was required to implement. The Emperor protects, he concluded, but sometimes protection requires choices that no honorable man should have to make. Your mercy honors what we fight for. Our harsh justice preserves the system that makes such mercy possible. I was assigned to the Death Watch, the specialized kill teams that hunt the most dangerous xenos threats in the galaxy. It was a posting that would utilize my combat skills while keeping me far from situations where my troublesome conscience might interfere with Imperial policy. For 20 years, I served along battle brothers from a dozen different chapters, fighting Tyranid hive fleets, chaos cultists, and alien menaces that threatened entire sectors. The work was dangerous, often suicidal, and absolutely necessary for the survival of human civilization. But it was also work that allowed me to exercise the mercy I valued without contradicting Imperial doctrine. When we saved human populations from alien invasion, when we rescued Imperial forces from overwhelming odds, when we preserved entire worlds from extermination, mercy and duty were perfectly aligned. But even in the Death Watch, I found that mercy came with costs that doctrine could not adequately address. The xenos threats we faced were not uniformly evil. Some were simply alien species fighting for survival in a galaxy that offered them no place. Others were victims of circumstance, caught between competing forces that cared nothing for their welfare. During the purging of Hive Fleet Dagon, I encountered a Tau diplomatic mission that had been attempting to negotiate safe passage for civilian evacuation ships when the Tyranids arrived. The Tau were technically enemies of the Imperium, but they were also trying to save lives in a situation where everyone, human, Tau, and alien civilian alike, faced the same extinction. Imperial doctrine called for the elimination of all xenos forces, regardless of their immediate objectives. But tactical reality suggested that cooperation might serve everyone's interests better than conflict. The Tau possessed evacuation ships that could carry human refugees, while we possessed firepower that could protect those ships during their escape. I made the decision to coordinate our efforts, sharing intelligence about Tyranid movements while the Tau provided transportation for Imperial civilians who would otherwise have been consumed by the Hive fleet. It was a temporary alliance born of necessity, but it saved thousands of lives that would have been lost if I had followed orthodox protocols. The collaboration ended when the immediate crisis passed, with both sides returning to their normal adversarial relationship. But for a few crucial hours, mercy had transcended species barriers, creating a cooperation that benefited everyone involved. Such incidents became more common as my service with the Death Watch continued. Not because I sought them out, but because the complex realities of xenos combat repeatedly presented situations where mercy and tactical effectiveness were complementary rather than contradictory. I began to understand that the Imperium's rigid adherence to doctrinal purity often prevented it from achieving objectives that could be reached through more flexible approaches. By treating all xenos as equally threatening, Imperial forces sometimes created enemies where none need exist, and missed opportunities for tactical advantage that more nuanced policies might have provided. But the greatest revelation came during my final mission with the Death Watch, when our kill team was deployed to investigate reports of a new chaos cult on the frontier world of Cepheus Prime. What we found challenged everything I thought I understood about the nature of corruption and the meaning of loyalty. The cult had indeed been spreading throughout the planet's population, but their version of chaos worship was unlike anything in our training materials. Instead of the blood sacrifice and depravity typically associated with such movements, these cultists practiced a form of spirituality that emphasized compassion, mutual aid, and protection of the vulnerable. They called themselves the Children of Mercy, and their blasphemous doctrine taught that the Emperor had been corrupted by his own power, transformed from humanity's protector into its oppressor. They worshipped what they claimed was the Emperor's original nature, the compassionate healer who had sought to elevate humanity rather than dominate it. It was heresy of the most dangerous kind, not because it rejected imperial authority, but because it appealed to virtues that every loyal citizen had been taught to value. These cultists weren't motivated by greed or ambition or the promise of supernatural power. They were driven by the same desire to protect innocence that had shaped my own moral development. The investigation revealed that the cult had begun as a response to the brutal policies of the planetary government, which had implemented increasingly harsh measures to maintain order and extract resources for the imperial war machine. When peaceful protests and legal petitions failed to achieve any relief, some citizens had turned to alternative spiritual frameworks that justified resistance against unjust authority. But the cult's practices went beyond simple rebellion. They had established networks for feeding the hungry, protecting the abused, and providing medical care to those who couldn't afford imperial services. Their communities were more peaceful, more prosperous, and more genuinely happy than the orthodox imperial settlements we had observed. Most disturbing of all, their interpretation of the Emperor's will was not entirely incompatible with what I had learned about mercy and justice during my own moral struggles. They spoke of a divine figure who commanded love rather than fear, who valued compassion over compliance, who sought to elevate humanity rather than simply exploit its potential. The tactical solution was obvious. Eliminate the cult leadership, purge the contaminated population centers, and restore orthodox imperial authority through the traditional combination of terror and indoctrination. but the moral implications were more complex than any I had previously encountered. Were these people actually heretics, or were they following a more authentic interpretation of the Emperor's will than the brutal orthodoxy that claimed to represent his authority? Was their compassionate spirituality a corruption of imperial values, or a return to principles that had been lost in 10,000 years of institutional decay? I found myself unable to implement the standard purification protocols without first attempting to understand what these people actually believed and why their beliefs had proven so attractive to ordinary Imperial citizens. The cult leader, a former Imperial preacher named Thomas Meridian, agreed to meet with me under a flag of truce. His appearance was that of a man who had found peace after years of spiritual struggle, calm, confident, but bearing the marks of someone who had suffered greatly for his convictions. "I know why you're here, Space Marine," he said as we sat across from each other in a simple chamber that served as his study. "You've been sent to destroy us because we threaten the system that gives your superiors their power." "I've been sent to investigate reports of chaos corruption," I replied. "Whether I destroy you depends on what I find during that investigation." Meridian smiled, an expression that carried neither fear nor defiance, but genuine compassion for someone he recognized as trapped by circumstances beyond his control. "You won't find chaos here, Brother Aurelius. You'll find something far more dangerous to the Imperium's current leadership. You'll find the Emperor's true will, the compassion and mercy that they've spent millennia trying to eliminate from Imperial doctrine." Over the course of our conversation, Meridian explained how his own spiritual journey had led him away from Orthodox Imperial faith towards something that he claimed was more authentically loyal to the Emperor's original vision. He spoke of studying pre-Imperial texts, of finding references to a figure whose teachings emphasized love, sacrifice, and protection of the innocent. "The Emperor they want us to worship is a tyrant," he said. "A being who demands absolute submission and considers human beings nothing more than resources to be consumed in endless wars. But the real Emperor, the man who walked among us before ascending to the Golden Throne, taught something very different." His words carried a dangerous plausibility that I found more disturbing than any chaos corruption I had previously encountered. Because if he was right, if the compassionate interpretation of the Emperor's will was more authentic than the brutal orthodoxy enforced by Imperial institutions, then everything I had been taught about duty and loyalty was based on a fundamental deception. But even if Meridian's interpretation was correct, the practical consequences of accepting it would be catastrophic. The Imperium's stability depended upon absolute obedience to established authority. If individuals were encouraged to interpret the Emperor's will according to their own understanding of compassion and justice, the entire system would collapse into anarchy. "Even if you're right about the Emperor's original nature," I told him, "your teachings threaten the unity that keeps humanity alive in a hostile galaxy. Without Imperial authority, mankind would fragment into countless competing factions that could never resist the threats we face." "Would it?" Meridian asked. "Or would a humanity united by love and mutual aid be stronger than one held together by fear and oppression? Look at our communities. Are they weaker than Imperial settlements or stronger?" It was a question I couldn't answer without acknowledging truths that would undermine everything I had sworn to protect. The cult's communities were indeed more cohesive, more prosperous, and more genuinely loyal to each other than anything I had observed in Orthodox Imperial territories. But they were also heretical by definition, representing a direct challenge to the authority structures that maintained galactic civilization. No matter how beneficial their practices might be on a local level, they could not be allowed to spread without destroying the larger system that protected humanity from extinction. I made the hardest decision of my career. I would implement the purification protocols, but I would do so with the mercy that both versions of Imperial faith claimed to value. The cult leadership was arrested and executed, but their followers were given the opportunity to recant their heresies and return to Orthodox worship. The communities they had built were dismantled, but their beneficial practices were incorporated into legitimate Imperial social program wherever possible. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the brutal efficiency demanded by doctrine nor the compassionate justice advocated by the cultists. But it was the best solution I could devise for a situation that admitted no perfect answers. The aftermath of the Cepheus Prime mission marked the end of my service with the Death Watch and my return to the Ultramarines as a battle brother. My superiors were satisfied with the successful completion of the mission, but my own reports raised questions about my continued reliability as an officer. Chapter Master Kalga himself conducted my debriefing, reviewing my decisions during the investigation and evaluation of the cult. His questions revealed that he understood the moral complexity of the situation better than I had expected. "Brother Aurelius," he said after reading my final report, "you have consistently demonstrated that mercy and effectiveness can be compatible when applied with wisdom and restraint, but you have also shown that such wisdom requires moral courage that most warriors do not possess. The Imperium needs soldiers who can follow orders without question, but it also needs leaders who can adapt those orders to serve humanity's true interests. Your service record suggests that you understand this distinction better than most." It was the closest thing to approval I had received from chapter leadership since my first moral crisis on Mordak's 7th. But it came with a recognition that my approach to warfare would always place me at odds with the institutional orthodoxy that defined Imperial military doctrine. I was assigned to training duties, tasked with educating new Space Marine recruits in the tactical and moral complexities they would face during their service to the Emperor. It was work that allowed me to share the lessons I had learned about mercy, justice, and the sometimes conflicting demands of duty and conscience. The students I taught were young warriors eager to prove themselves in battle, convinced that honor lay in unquestioning obedience to authority and absolute commitment to Imperial doctrine. But I tried to show them that true honor required thinking as well as fighting, that effective leadership demanded moral courage as well as tactical skill. The Codex Astartes provides guidance, I would tell them, but wisdom must be applied to that guidance according to the specific circumstances you encounter. A Space Marine who cannot think is nothing more than a very dangerous servitor. Some of my students absorbed these lessons and went on to become leaders who could balance efficiency with compassion, strength with mercy. Others rejected what they saw as dangerous idealism and committed themselves to the kind of unthinking orthodoxy that Imperial institutions preferred. But all of them learned that mercy was not weakness, that protecting innocence was not sentimentality, and that the greatest honor lay not in following orders, but in serving the Emperor's true will as expressed through love for humanity. After 2 centuries of various capacities, I was granted the honor of retirement to a monastery world where aging Space Marines spent their final years in contemplation and prayer. It was a posting that most warriors viewed as a kind of death, the end of useful service and the beginning of irrelevant obsolescence. But for me, it represented the opportunity to finally understand what I had been fighting for throughout my long career. The monastery of St. Guillemot was a place of learning as well as worship, its libraries containing texts that spanned the entire history of the Imperium. I spent my days reading accounts of other warriors who had struggled with the same moral dilemmas I had faced, learning how they had resolved conflicts between mercy and duty. What I discovered was that my experiences were not unique. Throughout Imperial history, soldiers and officers had faced situations where compassion and doctrine demanded different responses. Some had chosen obedience and lived with the moral consequences of their actions. Others had chosen conscience and faced the institutional consequences of their defiance. But a few had found ways to serve both principles, to be merciful within the constraints of their duty and effective despite their compassion. These warriors had learned that mercy was not the enemy of strength, but its highest expression. That true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary and when it could be avoided. The Emperor himself, according to the oldest texts in the monastery's collection, had embodied this kind of strength. Before his ascension to the Golden Throne, he had been a figure who combined absolute power with genuine compassion, who sought to elevate humanity not through domination but through inspiration. The brutal orthodoxy that characterized modern imperial doctrine was a later development, a response to the practical necessities of governing a galaxy-spanning civilization under constant threat. But it was not the only possible interpretation of the Emperor's will, and it was not necessarily the most faithful to his original vision. As I spent my final years in study and contemplation, I came to understand that mercy was not a luxury that could be indulged when circumstances permitted. It was a necessity that distinguished civilization from barbarism, protection from oppression, honor from mere effectiveness. The Space Marines who showed mercy were not weaklings who had failed to grasp the harsh realities of their calling. They were warriors who understood that the purpose of strength was to make mercy possible, that the goal of war was to create conditions where compassion could flourish. I died peacefully in my sleep at the age of 394 standard years, my heart's finally giving out after centuries of enhanced service. My last thoughts were not of the battles I had fought or the enemies I had killed, but of the innocence I had protected and the mercy I had been able to show despite the harshness of the universe I served. The funeral ceremony was attended by dozens of Space Marines I had trained over the years, warriors who had learned to balance strength with compassion, efficiency with honor. They spoke of my service not in terms of tactical victories or doctrinal compliance, but in terms of the lives I had saved and the principles I had upheld. But the greatest testament to my legacy was not the words spoken at my funeral. It was the continuing service of warriors who had learned that mercy was not weakness, that protecting innocence was the highest calling of their order, and that true honor lay in serving humanity rather than simply following orders. This is what it's like to show mercy as a Space Marine in Warhammer 40k. To discover that compassion is not the enemy of strength, but its highest expression. To learn that the greatest victories are not won through violence, but through the wisdom to know when violence can be avoided. It is to understand that the Emperor protects not through the brutal efficiency of his armies, but through the mercy shown by warriors who remember that their strength serves a higher purpose than mere conquest. The universe is indeed dark, and there is only war, but within that darkness, mercy shines like a beacon, guiding those with the courage to follow it towards something better than mere survival. In the end, mercy is not what makes a Space Marine weak. It is what makes him human, what connects his service to something greater than duty or doctrine. And in a galaxy that offers so little hope, perhaps that humanity is the most precious thing any warrior can preserve.